Tonight's presentation, Stronger Than Sorrow, The Life of Dolley Madison, is about one of America's most famous women, formerly Dolley Payne Todd Madison. Portraying Dolley tonight is Anna Deitel. 200 years ago, an American citizen who did not have the right to vote was the most politically influential woman in the nation. She was, of course, our beloved Dolley Madison. Dolley was President James Madison's wife, the same James Madison who was the principal architect of our Constitution. Born in 1768, Dolley Payne was raised as a Quaker, formerly the Society of Friends, which may have been a key factor in the quality of education she received. Over 2,000 of her letters have survived, and her correspondence reveal a remarkable woman, possessed of intellect, charm, and beauty. Dolley married John Todd in 1790. Their marriage lasted just 3 years. In August 1793, her husband died from the yellow fever in Philadelphia, an epidemic that killed 5,000 people in just 4 months. But someone of Dolley's beauty and charm could not be long widowed, and she caught the eye of James Madison. They married in September 1794. At 43, Madison was 17 years older than Dolley, but they were a perfect match. Tonight's scene opens in the Octagon House drawing room. It is a crisp October evening in the year 1814. For the past month, the Madisons have occupied the Octagon House, located some 500 yards southwest of the burned-out shell of the White House. In the vernacular of the period, gentlemen and ladies, the First Lady of the United States, Mrs. Dolley Madison.
Hello, everyone. Congressman, I see you've come out this evening. Oh, your wife got you. I can see that. I can see. Oh, my darling. You will have to give me the lady who ordered your hat, for I must have a color of that feather in my collection. Afterwards, please, please, we shall talk. Good evening. Oh, thank you, good sir. Good evening. Oh, I am truly honored and delighted that you have all chose to come on such a joyful evening, but we just got great news. I take it you did not receive the letters in the mail from Congress. That is very fine. I shall tell you. Today, I received word that the final bill to move our great capital from this wonderful Washington to Philadelphia has been defeated. 83 to 74, we shall stay in Washington. Oh my goodness, I realize my gloves, these poor things are always getting off from me. They're all my favorite pair. Oh, a lady should never go with gloves. Whew, so sorry. You will have to excuse me, for we are all family in here, right? We are all Americans. Except for a few French, I'm sure. These are my favorite pair. You see, growing up under the watchful eye of my strict father, we were taught never to long for such things that would bring us vanity. As you can see, that has proved very difficult for me. You see, I was born a Quaker in New Garden, North Carolina. I would not spend much time there, for you see, my parents had, without one, moved myself and my siblings to our plantation in Virginia. It was a beautiful plantation, and I shall always consider myself a Virginian. I remember it was quite prosperous. My siblings and I would run through the fields. It's where I would receive my schooling. It is where my childhood would take place. We lived quite happily, my family and I, until the Revolutionary War started. Upon its end, my parents decided it was time for us to sell our plantation and free our slaves, for we were Quakers. He would take this money, and at 15 he moved us all to the great city of Philadelphia. That's right, people. I got to live in the city of Philadelphia. And it was everything I wanted it to be. I loved the city. I fell in love with the people, the fashion. But I was a devout Quaker. I wore my tulle cap. I wore my very, very plain gray gown. And it was with my lace kerchief held together by just a very plain brooch. Very plain. But this did not get me down, no. But you see, as I may have enjoyed living in the city, my dear father, who used all of the money we had from our plantation to invest in a starch business. And this business, as the days turned into weeks and months and into a year, continued to fail. And as it failed, my father began to fall ill himself. This weighed quite heavily on him, so much so that he was read out of the Society of Friends. He was no longer considered a Quaker in the eyes of our community. And he, from that moment, was never to leave his bed. Meaning myself, my brothers, my sisters, my mother were beginning to struggle financially. My mother, she began to run a boarding home, where my sisters and I would, of course, assist. However, this was barely enough money to get through, as it cost quite a much deal more to live in the great city of Philadelphia than it ever did to live in rural Virginia. So, on my father's deathbed, he calls me in, which he does very rarely do. I remember getting very close, and I ask, what is it that he would like? He tells me it would be in my best interest if I were to accept the marriage proposal given by a young gentleman who he had done business with many, many times through the last year. That fellow was Mr. John Todd. He was a delightful man, a very successful lawyer, and, well, of course, a devout Quaker, making him, as a measure of a man, a prize fit for marriage, truly. So as my father lay there, awaiting death, I accepted Mr. Todd's proposal, and we were to be married in 17 and 90. Did I marry for love like I had hoped? Sadly, no. But that does not mean we did not have a quite happy marriage. You see, we were blessed with two beautiful boys, my dearest Hayne and my tiny baby William. We were a very happy family. John continued to be a successful lawyer in Philadelphia. His family lived close by. And yet again, our life became steady, consistent, and happy. And then, the summer of 1793, yellow fever was to strike Philadelphia. It left only death in its wake. It came fast. I remember packing my bags, packing my boys' bags, but as I went to pack my dear John's things, he tells me, Dolly, you must stop. For his parents were some of the first to fall ill to the fever. And he, the loving man he truly was, would not be separated from his parents to leave them to die alone in Philadelphia. So that evening, I loaded the carriage. My boys and I were to leave, and my dear husband was to stay. I took them to the countryside, where the air was a wee bit easier to breathe. And he would write to me. He would write to me telling how he was taking care of his parents, how he was taking care of our neighbors and our friends and those who were unable to get out. And each letter I would write to him in return begged him, pleaded him to come to us, be a family again, but to stay as safe as he could. I received the final letter. This letter informed me his parents had passed, and that he would be joining the boys and I on the countryside. And I was truly excited until he came. Within days, he too fell to the fever. There was nothing I could do. For you see, that evening, I had to consign not only my husband, but my dear, sweet, and tiny William to the same grave. And I did not get away unscathed. I, too, fell to the fever. And as I lie in my bed, I knew I had to fight. You see, I could not bear to leave my dear Payne orphaned in this world. And fight I did. And upon gaining my health, I took my dear Payne by the hand, and we boarded our carriage. And a grieving widow I was, we returned to Philadelphia, to our home, which was, as of current, no longer ours. For you see, Payne and I had used what last of our money we had to bury my dear John and my sweet William. Our financial security was wavering, and I had known that my dear John had left his estate money as well as his personal effects to both myself and my dear Payne, but his wording for a lawyer was very poor. I started to panic a bit. I wrote to my only brother-in-law, the last surviving Todd, asking where were his effects? Where was the estate money that was supposed to be ours so that we could live? Do you know what I heard? Do you? I heard crickets in the wind. I began to write a letter each day, and I heard nothing. As dear Payne and I grew penniless by the days, I began to panic. I had no plan. And then, on a remarkable morning, I received a letter from my brother-in-law. I was delighted. I remember tearing it open, reading it, assuming all that was going to be made well. But I will have you know that he informs his dearest Dolly, as he wrote, that I will not see any money from his estate, and that I would, however, see a portion of the money that he will earn from selling my husband's personal effects as he sees fit. That was it. He proceeds to tell me, actually, that he was going to start with my dear husband's library. His library, the one possession he had worked hard to build, the one possession he has wanted to pass to our sons so that they can continue to grow and study from. And he was to sell them piece by piece and decide what portion Payne and I were due. I had had enough. I may be a woman, but I know what I deserved and what my dear Payne deserved. So I get my quill out and I write a letter, but not to my brother-in-law, no. I write a letter to our dear friend, a Mr. William Wilkinson. He was a great friend of my dear John and fellow lawyer. I write him about my case, and I ask if he would speak on my behalf. For as you know, a woman cannot go to court asking for any estate money. You must have a male present. And he, of course, immediately obliged. And upon our court hearing, I am happy to announce to all of you, Payne and I got not only the estate money, but all of John's personal effects, including his library. Oh, finally, Payne and I were financially set for now. But I was still a woman, and I was going to need a husband. And of course, my dear Payne was going to need a father. A father that, of course, would love him as if he was his own kin. A father that would care for not only him but me from the depths of his heart. For I would marry no one less. And it was upon this great evening that a fine friend of mine was to walk up my steps and knock on my door. Do you know who that fellow was? It was the great Aaron Burr. You see, he was a frequent visitor to my mother's boarding home. I became quite acquainted with him. And he comes up to me with his devilish smile, and he tells me that there was a congressman who was quite intent on meeting me. And I was very eager to figure out who this congressman was. It was none other than the great little Madison. I was intrigued, yes, but mostly puzzled. For you see, I don't know much of Mr. Madison other than what our friends are saying about him. And that, my dear, was, I think, cold, repressive, and mute. I was very intrigued, but yes, very puzzled indeed. You see, also, there was the fact that I was a mere 25 years of age. He was 43. I was a Quaker. He was an Episcopalian. I am not very much for slavery. He owned dozens of slaves. And I shall tell you, I love bright colors. And he likes the color black. From head to toe. Every day. I love delightful parties and people. He would much rather be at home in front of his fireplace. So, as you see, having practically nothing in common, I, of course, accept this invitation to. So I remember trying to figure out what gown shall I wear. I picked a beautiful shade of mulberry. And I remember meeting Mr. Madison for the first time. It was more about meeting Mr. Madison for the first time. But I shall tell you all, that dinner, I was quite smitten with the great little Madison after that dinner. So much so that within that summer, he proposed marriage. Fine marriage it would be. I knew he would be delighted to father my dear Payne. So of course I accept his proposal. We were to be married at my sister's house in Virginia. Oh, it was a beautiful, beautiful fall day. And I was to be Miss Dolley Madison. Now I shall tell you, as you all know, John was not a Quaker. Or James, John absolutely was a Quaker. A devout one at that. James was not a Quaker. And marrying Mr. Madison prior to the full year of grief that I was to take from losing my dear John, I, like my father, would be read out of the society of friends, and in our community no longer looked at as a Quaker, regardless of my beliefs here. This, however, did not weigh on me quite like it did my father. I was truly excited at the notion that James and I together we're going to go to Montpelier. Together we shall raise my son, our son as of current. Together we were going to run a household. And quite frankly, from that moment on, James and I were never ever apart, other than one time when I busted my knee. But I tell you, he wrote to me every single day for those 2 weeks. Every day. I loved living in Montpelier. I loved the life we created together more than I had ever thought I could. However, farming life did not take for James the way it did for his father. No, he did not have the green thumb his father had. Not quite like mine. I, surprisingly, took to gardening quite well. But as the spring frost on our mountaintop would continue longer and longer into each season, and crops would die continually, he began to lose focus on the great Montpelier. At the same time, the heat in politics was rising. Federalists, the Republicans, everybody was in arms. So of course, where did he turn his sights to? Right back to politics. And I let him go to do whatever it is he wanted in that realm. For you see, the great Thomas Jefferson, a great friend of ours on the mountain across, called to us and asked us if we would come over, for he had a great question to ask us. We, of course, won't. Well, you see, Thomas was to be our great nation's third president of the United States. And we were truly proud of him. He was to ask my dear husband to be the Secretary of State. Well, that meant that our new home was about to change. To Washington we took. I was quite excited. I packed our things quite fast. I was very excited to begin a social circle. Upon arriving to Washington and moving in, it becomes extraordinarily apparent that we were in need of a social circle, a sphere where people could come together and talk of things other than politics. Anything other than politics. So, I did what I knew best. I, though not a large home that we lived in currently, would invite everyone. I would invite both Republicans, both Federalists, the simple farmer, people I knew who had common ground in other subjects, to my dinner table. And I would make sure that everyone was taken care of. And they became bigger and bigger, and everyone suddenly wanted to come. We would fill our tiny home to the full brim, to the point where we would have people enjoying their Madeira on our front steps, because there was simply no more room to put them in our home. But before I knew it, James came to me and told me that he himself was going to run for president. Oh, boy. And will you know, he won that race, and we were about to move into the executive mansion. The executive mansion. The parties I could throw, the people I could bring together. I was truly excited and very proud of what my dear James had done, and the ability that we were going to have now to shape America in the way we had always talked about. This was no small matter, though, because as you know, Mr. Jefferson, he left the executive mansion in, well, a rather bachelor state, if you will. So, first thing I do was, of course, enlist the help of a Mr. Benjamin Latrobe. He was a gentleman you may have heard of. He built the Capitol building as well as the outside of the executive mansion, so I thought he would be a perfect fit to help me decorate the inside. Well, he wasn't perfect, but he will do. began. We wanted to make sure that we created a stronghold that would hold for multiple administrations after ours. We wanted a beacon for other diplomats to come and know that we were new as a country, but we were strong. So I started with the finish. I made sure each one was American-made. I then changed what at the time was Mr. Jefferson's private office into our dining room. There were windows along the full wall. It was truly a delight. I take the picture painted by Mr. Gilbert Stuart of Mr. George Washington, and I put it in the popular room upon the entrance of the mansion. It is on this topic that Mr. Benjamin the Trost tells me I am wrong. Well, he tells me the proper place for such a portrait was to be in the dining room, of course, where the natural light could hit it. And I suppose I caved and let him put it there. So be it. For this will not be the only topic him and I shall go toe-to-toe on. For you see, my favorite color, of course, is red. And I choose the most vibrant red velvet curtains to hang from the windows. And I, of course, pick velvet red cushions to match. He came in that day, stopped dead in his tracks, and asked me what I was to do with my guests when we have blinded them from sight. I do not truly believe it was my guest's sight that he was concerned about. I do believe it was his reputation. But I shall tell each of you, his reputation as of current is still intact. And before we knew it, Mr. Latrobe and I had finished. The executive mansion was ready to open his doors. For you see, it had never been done to the public until this moment. It was a Wednesday night. I had sent out an invitation to every citizen, from the politician to the simple farmer. Everyone was welcome to Dolley's parties. They will later be known as squeezes, for you see. Even at the mansion, we had to squeeze everybody into these big rooms, shoulder to shoulder. But I took care of everybody and made sure everyone was welcome. I provided cakes, food, champagne, ports, and of course, I know I see it, you've been waiting for ice cream. Not just any ice cream, no, Dolley. Dolley would serve oyster-flavored ice cream. I know, you're all salivating at the thought. They were everything we as a country needed. We were bringing together people and making them have true conversation, whether it be about music, philosophy, Latin. But they were talking instead of fighting. For how can a country move forward if all we do is fight amongst ourselves? However, all this delightful partying did not come without backlash. For you see, oh, the papers. The papers would attack my character quite vulgarly. They would say horrendous things. For you see, a woman engaging in any form of politics was considered positively scandalous, even if that scandal means throwing a simple party, maybe a tea. That is not how they would see it. And do you know what we do, us ladies, when a gentleman and or a newspaper attacks our character in such a way? Okay, I shall tell you. You simply smile back. For you see, when somebody attacks your character in such a manner, they are trying to ruin your sensibility. And we shall never give them that. But the papers were not the worst of it. For you see, upon moving to Washington, my dear Payne began to really show struggle. He struggled with schooling. He struggled with finding a job. He began to struggle with gambling. He began to struggle with drinking. And through that struggle, I felt him pulling away from me. And this weighed heavy on my heart, for this was my boy, who I would do anything for, my only son. James knew this weighed quite heavily on me. So do you know what James did? He offered my dear Payne a job. He offered him a secretary to a delegate in Europe. I was so proud, and James, as always, cared so deeply for my boy. But that pride was not long-lived, for you see, the moment he left us for France, the letters stopped. I had to start writing to dear friends, asking what my boy was up to. And quite disappointingly, they would write back that they would see him gambling away his money. They would see him buying pieces of artwork he had no money to pay for. And quite frankly, they saw him doing everything but his job. And I was unable to do anything to stop it. But this was not even the worst yet. For this summer, I received a letter from the British, no less. And that letter read to me that if I were to continue staying in my home in Washington, that the British would come, burn the house down around my head, take me prisoner, and parade me through the streets of London. It does sound nice, right? I assumed on the front of the parade, waving of course. But no, this is not what they meant. So, of course, we here in Washington are taking means for defense. And I shall tell you, sir, that though I am a Quaker, I firmly believe in fighting back when attacked. And also, I keep a little old saber on me at all times, just in case. You all should too. We began to wait. And then my dear James came to me and said that they were here, and that he had to take our armies up the Potomac to meet them in Bladensburg, and that he shall be back in time for dinner. And he leaves. And now upon his leave, Washington began to panic in true chaos. Our citizens, our congressmen, everyone began to flee the city. And I do not blame them. But I stayed. And I, that morning, woke up with my gut telling me the worst was to come. I went to the roof with my spyglass, hoping I would see dear James riding in with our armies. I looked south, I looked north, west, and east. I saw nothing. But I went in, and I asked my dear Paul Jennings to continue to set the table as if we were going to eat dinner that night, as if we had already won the battle. He brought up the champagne and the port. He began to set the table, and it is at that moment that we hear the footsteps of a horse riding in. So we all run out, and it is the young James Smith riding in on his horse, screaming on the top of his lungs, waving at us that we needed to clear out, for they had lost, and that the British were coming, and we had very little time. A carriage pulls up, and a Mr. Carroll, it tells me I need to leave immediately. And I could not, for I knew what I had to do next, and that was have the help that I had left, which was not a lot, ladies and gentlemen, collect all of the political papers, the political silver, anything of value, and I shoveled it all into different carriages, heading in different directions, of course. And that's when I turned my sights to the Gilbert Stuart painting. I ordered that to be unscrewed from the wall, for I knew we could not let such a prize fall to the British, to be paraded like a victory flag as if they had already won. So, as they handled that, I continued to grab papers I saw, and of course, I grabbed those red curtains. Could not leave those behind. I continued until I could no longer. And as I stopped to get a little panicky, I asked, what is taking so long on the Gilbert picture? They could not unscrew it from the wall. So we did what we knew best. Took it apart. And I had my dear Paul out to cut it, roll it up, and we sent it in another direction from the other carriages. And that was when I knew that I was likely not to return to this home. And where I was to be the next day, I do not know. I did not know if I was to see my dear James. I did not know if I was to see my dear sister, who I had finally wrote a letter to, informing her that I shall write when I get to my next destination. Oh, and there was one more thing, of course. I saw the sweet Jean-Pierre Suzant walking by my carriage, and I called to him to run back into the mansion, and of course, grab my sweet dear Polly the macaw and take her to the Octagon House, where I knew she would be safe until the end of this tragic war, as later would be known as Madison's War. And that was it. I boarded my carriage, and I was off. A day later, I was reunited with my dear James. I felt so calm until we were to return to Washington. They had burned everything to the ground. They started with the Capitol building, then they moved to the Executive Mansion. Not before, however, from what I am told, they engaged in a delightful dinner served by me. But then they burned it, all of it. James and I returned to the Octagon House, as you all have come to join us at. This will be our home for the next 6 months. And it was now that people began to talk. They began to question whether Washington was the proper place for our nation's capital. And on this matter, I am not so sure. For do we pack up what we have spent years building and run back to Philadelphia like dogs with our tails between our legs? No. We were to stay and rebuild. And do you know how I got everyone to see the vision for this capital that I saw? Do you know, madam? I threw dinner parties. And again, our house was quite smaller than the mansion, but I would bring everyone in and remind them why we needed to rebuild this city, to stay right where we were, to show the British that we do not run. And I invited each and every one of you here tonight because we have won that battle. For Washington shall stay the capital of these United States. And I shall tell you all a great secret. one that has helped me through my whole life. And that secret is that we have all a great hand in the formation of our own destiny. And I thank you very much for attending this evening's festivities. Now, as you all know, I am not the wonderful, remarkable Dolley Madison. I, however, have had the great honor of studying this woman for the past 2 years. And I shall tell you all that her woes did not end with rebuilding Washington. For she and James were to go back to Montpelier at the end of his administration, and from that point, she would nurse him until he passed in 39. And upon that time, Paine would continue to become in debt, continue to come to her asking for money to cover these debts. And she would sell off pieces of Montpelier until she had to sell the whole estate to cover her son. She then, with what little financial money she had, would move back to Washington. She would only be able to throw a party maybe once every 2 months due to her new financial situation. However, there was no party that Dolley Madison was not invited to. For Washington society would tell you that there is no party that is official until Dolley Madison was present. She would also act as a social advisor to the Van Burens, the Tyler, and the Polk administration. She also gained a honorary seat in Congress, which at the time was the only private citizen to do such a thing. And believe it or not, she was asked to send the very first personal telegraph, which she sent to Baltimore. She was a remarkable woman, and upon her death, she was 81 years old. The whole nation mourned a woman who not only created the style of Washington, but the meaning of our nation's great capital. And I thank you all for having me this evening. I would love to answer any questions anyone may have regarding either myself as Anna or Dolley Madison. Does anybody have any questions about this remarkable woman? Yes. The lovely lady asked if it was illegal as a Quaker to marry the James Madison. Illegal? No. You had the ability to marry who you wanted. However, if you married outside of the Quaker religion, you would be what was considered read out, meaning you were no longer considered a Quaker by the Society of Friends. So they may still talk to you, but they would no longer consider you one of their own. So you would have to form to a new religion or continue on personal track of a Quaker, of course. Does that answer your question, Deanna? Yes, madam?
Why was Dolley Madison's father written out?
For he had, so in the lovely lady asked why Dolley's father was read out of the Society of Friends. He was read out because he failed as a businessman. And in the eyes of the Quakers, you could not fail. If you were a farmer, you had to do it right, and you had to be a prosperous, either plantation or personal farmer. If you were a lawyer and you became unsuccessful or were ever barred, read out. They were a very elite society for believing in such modesty, in my opinion. Does that answer your question? Oh yes, it is extremely harsh. And at the end of Dolly's life, not only would she be read out, her father would be read out, only her sister Anna would be, and her mother would be the only remaining Quakers in that family. It was a very select group for having such modest rules, in my opinion. But yes. Yes, sir?
The first husband, Todd, any relation to Mary Todd?
That is a very good question, sir. That I am not certain enough to. I am not certain enough to answer that with directness. The gentleman asked if my first husband, Mr. John Todd, was related to Mary Todd Lincoln. And that I am truly uncertain, and I am so sorry. Is there any others? Over here.
I understand that Dolley Madison was set the example for fashion in Washington as well. Can you tell us about your headdress of your fashion?
This wonderful lady here has said I was the elite in fashion, and I shall tell you, madam, I wish I had that title. Most of what Dolly pulled from would be Josephine with the plummeting V, as Josephine, when she married Napoleon, wore a very plummeting gown. This would be picked up immediately by Dolly. The moment she saw that gown, or heard of that gown, she had it made and sent over. And I read in my research with her, I read that the very first time Dolly walked out in her, what would be considered a Regency-style gown, Miss Abigail Adams had to blush from the amount of skin shown by Dolly. She really was a fashion-forward lady. She wanted to make sure she was always ahead of the game in any way she could. She had ladies in France, she had ladies in England, and she had ladies throughout the colonies that would buy things for her as they saw them, regardless of what was going on, and they would send them to her. And some would fit, and that would be great, but some did not. But she would have almost the original secret shoppers, if you will. And they would send her all kinds, and she was always known for wearing a large form of paradise bird feather, which I did have this afternoon. Unfortunately, this gust of winds in through Norfolk blew my feathers from my hat and right down the road. And I was unable to go chase them because the oncoming traffic was a little intense, so we went featherless tonight. However, Dolly would have never done such a thing. And she used those feathers as a tool, believe it or not. She would wear those so that James would always know where she was at. For she was very good at keeping James in a dark, well, she didn't. James would stay in dark corners. And she would bring the politicians that James would need to speak to. She would lure them with cake and ice cream. And she would bring them over and, oh, here's my dear James. He would love to talk to you. And pawn them off. And she used that as almost like a shark. As the fin of, watch out, Dolly's coming. Here she is. Is there any other? Yes, my dear. Dolly's mother was a very, very devout, quiet Quaker. The most that she had done, she did run the boarding home in Philadelphia. She got into that the moment that her husband was read out. That was the only form of money and currency that she had. And she passed of natural causes, but shortly after Dolly was to marry James. And Dolly and her sister Anna would become basically the soul left of that family. She didn't speak much to the rest of her siblings after that.
Did all of the artifacts that were taken from the executive mansion prior to the burning find their way back?
All but one carriage, from what I read. One carriage carrying parts of the silver, the candlestick, not it was lost. No one had ever brought that back. There was no mention of what happened to that. However, all the papers, the picture, as well as the silver, and of course those velvet curtains, all made it back to her and back to what would later be rebuilt as the Executive Mansion, which they brought Mr. Latrobe on to start, but that's where his reputation got ruined, and they kicked him out.
Mrs. Madison.
Oh, yes, sir. Oh.
Your squeeze awaits you.
Oh, I'm delighted.
And ladies and gentlemen, if you could remain seated just for a little bit, I beg your indulgence.
And it was truly an honor